morning for the first session, and I think with that, we'll just get started.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Today we're talking about values influencing policy options. That's the title of our panel. Yesterday we were enlightened on the kinds of values that actually influence people to acting violently, value systems that may correlate or make that easier. And today we'll talk about the policy implications of values in containing terrorism. We have 4 speakers today because unfortunately one of our speakers was unable to join us today. I'd like to just announce for our speakers that if you are not speaking into a microphone, the audience that's with us by webcast will not be able to follow along, so I'd urge you to do that. Our first speaker this morning is Martha Crenshaw from Wesleyan University, who will be speaking to us about old terrorism versus new terrorism.
My topic is not exactly about the values behind public policy, but it was what the organizers of this conference requested in terms of the papers I was prepared to give. My subject is actually change in terrorism over time, or old versus new terrorism. And those of you who have my paper in your packet, I'm not going to give the paper. You can read it, and I've given it several times already. So I have something relatively new to say, but it builds on the paper. So what I want to talk about is change in terrorism over time and why and whether it's reasonable to talk about a new terrorism since the 1990s. When I was preparing my notes for this talk, I was reminded that when I was in graduate school, I took a seminar called Processes of Change, which is an interesting graduate seminar. And in that seminar, we read a little book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. A lot of us read that in graduate school. And, of course, he's famous in political science for having introduced the term paradigm to all of us, which, of course, got overused constantly. But you recall his argument that change in scientific paradigms of explanation occur when there are anomalies or puzzles that the old paradigms can no longer explain. And this occurs gradually. It's not just that our knowledge is deepened, that we know more and more and more about science, but it's a difference in interpretation. So in thinking about whether or not there's a new terrorism, I thought, well, perhaps a good way to get at this would be to ask, what is the puzzle or anomaly in contemporary or modern terrorism that our older understandings of terrorism do not permit us to explain? What is the problem that we are up against? Now, there's been an ongoing discussion of old versus new terrorism actually for quite some time. And Steve Simon, who's here, and Bruce Hoffman, who's here, have both been engaged in that debate. And so, as I'm sure they know, I've been somewhat on the critical side, but I'm not the only one. In my paper, you'll see a list of other people who've engaged this debate. So it's a lively and ongoing debate in sort of the circle of people who study terrorism. Now, talking about the new terrorism is actually not new. In 1996, the historian Walter Lacour referred to postmodern terrorism in an article in Foreign Affairs. But when I began to trace this back, I discovered that in 1975, David Fromkin, whom I believe is a journalist, also in Foreign Affairs talked about the new terrorism. So the idea that there's something new out there actually goes pretty far back. Now, if we look at terrorism over time and the historical development of terrorism over time, in the background, you see that there's certainly a lot of things about terrorism that have not changed fundamentally or abruptly over time. And I'll just mention a few of these, and not to be exhaustive, but simply to draw on what we do know about terrorism. One is the role of diasporas, which is something we've not discussed so far very much at this conference. It's been important to the development of terrorism, I think, from the beginnings of modern terrorism in the 19th century. We all remember that it was Irish Americans who supported the Fenians and the Irish Republican Brotherhood in the 19th century. And up until really the 1980s, a lot of the IRA's fundraising was in the United States. We sometimes conveniently forget that when we're condemning supporters of terrorism. Armenian diaspora was important to the activities of the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia and the Justice Commandos of the Armenian Genocide. In fact, it was according to many people, the withdrawal of support from the diaspora that led to the demise of both of these groups. Another important diaspora in the development of terrorism, the Tamil diaspora. Many people think that the LTTE really could not function without the support of diasporas, particularly in Canada and in Britain. So all these diasporas are very important. So now we have Muslims in European countries, particularly in Britain, but again, this is not a new phenomenon. The role of the diaspora has always been critical to the use of violence in this way. The issue of the participation of women that Marilyn addressed yesterday. A woman was one of the terrorists hanged for the assassination of the Tsar Alexander II in 1881. There have often been women participants in terrorism, not always the leaders. It's fairly rare for them to be the leaders, but the participation of women is nothing new. In fact, in my course on terrorism, I assigned to my students chapters from the memoirs of Emma Goldman, in which they make the decision to try to assassinate Henry Frick. She describes her frustration at not being able to go with Alexander Berkman to actually shoot Frick. And she was told that her skills as an orator made her too valuable to sacrifice in this endeavor, because Berkman didn't expect actually to survive, and he knew that if he did, he would spend a long term in prison. He optimistically thought that he would kill Frick. Because he did not kill Frick, he got a reasonably short prison time and was deported at the end of his prison time, along with Emma Goldman, because of all of her rhetoric. The concept of self-sacrifice or martyrdom in terrorism, again, nothing new. The Russian revolutionaries often went with their bombs. The clumsiness and weight of the bombs that they threw in the 1870s and 1880s was such that you were unlikely to survive either the shock waves of the bomb or the shrapnel from the bomb. So, and then also they took pride in the fact that they would be put on trial and then executed. Some refused to be pardoned because they wished to die for the sake of the cause. The concept of martyrdom is, of course, strong in Irish terrorism. Led to hunger strikes. The same route that leads people to kill others with themselves, I think, can be traced to things like hunger strikes, self-immolation, other cases of what we call sometimes political suicide, although the people who commit this type of action almost always, I would say, always reject the term suicide. They prefer self-sacrifice or martyrdom. But again, this is not unique to the contemporary period or to Islam by any means. Another common feature in terrorism over time, processes of radicalization at the individual and at the group level, something that is of great interest to us now, particularly looking at the radical conspiracies in Europe. We know that, for example, that terrorism is not the result of psychopathology. It's very rare, actually, that people who are terrorists are abnormal in any kind of psychological sense. We know that the group dynamics are critically important to the functioning of their operations. All these are commonalities, I think, in terrorism over time. Now, another issue would be the way in which terrorist conspiracies are organized. And I'm not going to go into this because we had a paper yesterday. We're going to have another paper this morning on the ways in which terrorist groups are organized. I'll only say that if we think of decentralization as an entirely modern phenomenon, we should look back at the anarchists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who were the epitome of decentralization because they did not believe in authority at all. Sometimes they were better organized, actually, than the image goes. Another common aspect of terrorism is that in my study of history, these groups have always tried to take advantage of technological advances in weapons of destruction, whether it was a revolver, whether it was dynamite, whether it was plastic explosives, whether it was radio-controlled detonators. They've always been very quick off the mark to take advantage of these things and have prided themselves, by and large, on being quick, on being adaptable, on being, in the Russian case, very scientific. They thought of terrorism as something that was very scientific because it took advantage of the most modern means of destruction. Now, the puzzle that people most commonly point to when they argue that we need a new approach to terrorism is the willingness, indeed the eagerness, to cause very large numbers of casualties in acts of terrorism that the sociologist Jeff Goodwin has referred to as categorical terrorism, sometimes referred to as indiscriminate terrorism, but I think his term is preferable in that you don't care who the individual is, it is the category to which that individual belongs that you're attacking, be it all policemen, be it all Americans, be it all Israelis, be it all representatives of the hated state, the post office, whatever. This is a symbolic, representative quality of terrorism, and it is this that concerns us. So what is the cause of the increased lethality of terrorism is the puzzle that the argument that we need a new terrorism is meant to address. And the reason that's most often given is religion. Now, the idea that religion might inspire terrorism is not in itself new. Some of you have probably read the article by David Rappaport in the American Political Science Review back in about 1981, in which he talked about the thugs, although I think he was wrong about the thugs. I don't think they were terrorists at all. But he talks about the zealot Sicarii and, of course, the assassins of medieval Islam, which now has come to our attention, almost always mentioned when people come to a discussion either of Islamist terrorism or of so-called suicide terrorism. So I want to raise two questions about this linkage, about this puzzle or anomaly that we might need a new approach to explain. The first is a set really of empirical questions, and that is a question about causal linkages. Empirically, is terrorism that's associated with religion always more lethal, more indiscriminate, more linked to causing mass casualties? And this is just an empirical question. Now, one problem in answering this question is determining which groups are religious in motivation. What does that mean for a group to be religious in motivation? So I went to the list of terrorist groups that's maintained by the National Memorial Institute for the Prevention of Terrorism in Oklahoma City. Its data come mostly from the RAND Corporation, but they have within their data a classification set of terrorist groups. The classification is actually done by a different consulting firm in Washington, and they don't provide their reasons for classifying groups as one thing or another, just somewhat curious to a social scientist. But be that as it may, if you take, say, the 20 groups classified as religious that have killed the most people, just simply, you find that the majority of them are classified as religious and something else. Ethno-nationalist, right-wing, whatever. They're not exclusively religious. Very few are. And if you separate out the two, the hybrid group and the purely so-called religious group, well, the difference is not that great between the lethality, again, measured in terms of number of people killed. Furthermore, the classification could be called into question. For example, they put the Lord's Resistance Army of Uganda as a purely religious group. And specialists in Uganda find that a rather puzzling attribution. If you know anything about this group, it is rather strange. And then there are other odd groups. How do you tell, if you're dealing with a hybrid group, what's driving that group? Is it the nationalist part or is it the religious part? Take the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which before it became the Islamic Liberation Front was just the Liberation Front. So is it liberation or Islam that's behind the new Moro Front? Well, it's very hard to say which might be the driving force and which might lead to lethality, although this group is not particularly lethal. So we have to ask, is al-Qaeda really trying to destroy the United States in some sort of apocalyptic crescendo, or is it trying to overthrow the regimes in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iraq, now to create an Islamic state, which is something that is not out of the realm of reason that could be accomplished? And why is the defense of the Ummah not as much like nationalism as like religion? What is the distinction there that makes this a religious goal as opposed to a nationalist goal, in effect, taken to the transnational level? The defense of Muslims everywhere could be the same as the defense of Armenians everywhere or Irish everywhere. And also, if we compare religious groups, even if we leave aside this problem of classifying them against secular groups, there certainly have been secular groups that have been willing to cause very large numbers of casualties, and a case in point would be Sendero Luminoso in Peru, which was responsible for a very large number of deaths according to the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Look at the FLN and the Battle of Algiers, one of my favorite cases, of course. They, by the standards of the time, kill large numbers, never mind the secret army organization or OAS, and never mind the anarchists for whom no bourgeois was innocent and who began the practice of throwing bombs into cafes and restaurants and even the French Parliament. Now, a set of conceptual questions. And here, I guess it's more of a statement than a question, but it is that perhaps we should reframe the question to get at the puzzle that we want to deal with. What leads groups to exercise restraint? that might be the real question that we want to ask, rather than saying, is religion associated with lethality? So what leads some groups to be more restrained than others? I was recently rereading a book by Eamon Collins called Killing Rage, which is his autobiography. He was a member of the IRA who wound up going over to the British in the end and confessing. The IRA promised that if he would recant his confession, that all would be forgiven. He recanted. They didn't forgive. He was killed. He was talking about why the IRA was more restrained. And he said it was not because they wanted to go to bargain with the British government. It's not because they wanted a spot at the table or wanted to, at this point in time, in the early 1980s, wanted to reduce their demands. Indeed, the IRA rejected the political path that Sinn Féin then was beginning to take, and they explicitly rejected it. He said what limited them was the tolerance of the Catholic community. And tolerance reflected in the fact that the IRA could not function and continue using violence against its chosen targets without a minimal level of passive support from the population. So it's a purely pragmatic concern on his part. If we go too far, they will inform on us to the British. We'll be done in. So it was as simple as that. Look at Albert Camus. Those of you familiar with his work, at least you probably remember a play he wrote called, in French, Les Justes, and translated, I think, into English as The Just Assassins. And here he distinguishes between two generations of Russian revolutionary terrorists. He admired the People's Will organization, the ones who assassinated the Tsar in 1881, but he did not like the Socialist Revolutionary Party because he said they knew no limits, that there were no limits to their violence. Now here are groups that are operating for the same cause in the same context. One has a sense of limits, the other does not. It did not. I don't think you could attribute it to their doctrine, although I recognize that there were doctrinal differences between the People's Will and the SRs. So I'm actually going to finish in plenty of time, so there'll be plenty of time for a question. This leads me back to a remark that Akil Bilgrami made yesterday. He was talking about the fact that the majority of Muslims in diasporas and in majority Muslim countries reject the extremists or absolutists or fundamentalists, as they're often called. And he said that the majority of Muslims would not oppose the minority, the extremist minority, because there were internal conflicts within that community, such that if you opposed the extremists, you felt that you were taking the side of the West. And how could you take the side of the West when Western forces are killing Muslims in Afghanistan, in Iraq, supporting Ethiopia, in Somalia? And so because of this participation of primarily the U.S., but other Western powers in these conflicts, means that you're not talking about necessarily active support for extremist groups, but a reluctance to withdraw passive support, a reluctance to inform on people. And I think this, what he calls a defensive psychology, means that standing up to extremists is going to be very difficult. So this might be the angle that we want to take when we try to understand why people would kill large numbers of civilians. And rather than trying to prove the relationship between lethality and religion, to simply pose it in a different way. What is the source of restraint? Why are some groups more reluctant than others to actually use categorical terrorism against their enemies or against collaborators for that matter? And getting to the policy implications of this, then if we're looking to bring terrorism to an end, then we would say, what could we do to assist a community in that withdrawal of support? Because we know that one of the purposes of terrorism, indeed, it goes beyond simply needing passive support. They want support from some quarter. We might also consider the fact that religion could be a source of restraint as well as a source of escalation toward violence in these movements. If you look back at the Russians in the 1880s, a lot of people are probably not aware that after the assassination of the Tsar in 1881, terrorism did not disappear. Most histories sort of skip over the period up until about 1901 when the socialist revolutionaries began to launch their own campaign of terrorism. But in 1887, I believe, or it could have been 1886, Alexander Ulyanov was hanged for trying to assassinate the Tsar. And he's of interest because he was Lenin's brother, among other things. And many people think that that influenced Lenin's revolutionary attitudes, that it might have made him more ruthless and more determined to succeed. But one interesting thing about this, and of course this is a purely secular group, they indeed thought they would go with their bomb. The bomb was disguised in a big, heavy book, and it was a medical dictionary, so that nobody would think it was odd that someone was carrying this big, heavy book around. It's very well disguised. And inside it had little bits of lead, like the ball bearings that people use now, and they were coated with strychnine. And they were going to throw this at the Tsar on a very crowded street, Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg, and the damage among the bystanders would have been quite large. They were certainly willing to kill a fairly large, it was a crowded street, they would have known this, and they were prepared to do this. The plot was disrupted before they were able to carry it out. So when we think that it's only religion that leads people to be willing to kill large numbers, they were certainly willing to do so. So I'm going to conclude on that note to say that I think perhaps we should reframe the debate, and that might be a more useful path to finding, if not a solution, we're not in charge of the solution, I don't think, but at least in moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Is this clear? Okay, audio. Have you dealt with the issue of media as a questioning the role of media as far as restraint goes?
Mm-hmm.
You would have a community exercise restraint, then what can be done to reduce the impact of media, so to say? Because it seems like to me that terrorism is often accentuated by publicity. That's one of the desires of terrorist groups, it appears to me. They desire publicity. So if media, if the publicity can be restricted, nullified,
the relationship between the media and terrorism, particularly escalation of terrorism, people have been concerned about that for quite a long time. And as we were mentioning yesterday, many of the terrorists of the 19th century fled repressive regimes, for example, in Germany, to more open regimes like Britain or the United States, where they could publish their revolutionary manifestos and their instructions for how to make dynamite and how to build bombs. So this is also not a new problem. But certainly the argument has been made in two directions. One, that the media are a facilitating cause in the fact that they provide publicity to terrorists. And on the other side, they've also been accused of, in effect, instigating terrorism by both publicizing grievances, atrocities that might motivate terrorism, by facilitating contagion and imitation. What can be done about it if that is indeed the case? If Margaret Thatcher was right, she said publicity was the lifeblood of terrorism. And the thing is, I think in order to have a free press, it's really very difficult to implement any sort of measures that would censor the news. What's happened in the United States has been more sort of, hope this is not a sign of something. I still got the mic. Yeah, it's the last call. It's very early for the last call. Okay. But very difficult in a liberal democracy to say that there's going to be some sort of government control of the press and sort of restraint. However, the media, and certainly back in, I believe this would be the early 1980s, mid-1980s, on the occasion of coverage of violence in Lebanon, hijacking in 1985 in particular, the media announced that they were going to exercise voluntary restraint. Well, it's definitely a signal. But as far as my observation would say that sort of voluntary restraint didn't last very long. The competition, because the news media are largely commercial, means that you all know the slogan, if it bleeds, it leads. The only thing that would change it would be if everybody gets tired of reading about it. If we think, oh, ho-hum, another hijacking, another bombing, another suicide attack, then they'll stop covering it. So in terms of, is there a policy answer to that, other than saying, could you put it on page 3 rather than 1? Which I think sometimes reading the New York Times, I think that they do.
And that's because they want to rally in all the groups they can, including the Christians who will present themselves, they'll come back with cultural goals and they can become Jew. But of course, then they also pull out all the religious stuff. So when Irani went on his Rav Yatra, he used all his roads and chariots and used all his drama with his arrows and so on. And they'll do whatever they can. They succeed in persuading people that they are the religion to the extent that the liberal side is completely and if any person who's not on the right says, oh, I think we should learn more about Hinduism, everyone says, oh, what's the matter with you? You've gone over to India. So that kind of cultural situation allows them to monopolize the religious symbolism. But really, if one had to ask if it's religion or not, it's that's a useless question. Rather than just to describe which parts of it are religious and which parts are not.
Well, I share your skepticism about these classifications clearly, and I'm reminded of a couple of other aspects of this very complicated relationship that a classification system risks simplifying in a very misleading way. And one would be the fact that many people studying radical Islamist groups discover that the people who are recruited into such groups actually know very little about religion. They know a bit of syncretic doctrine that they've been taught by particular leaders. And what they find is that in terms of who's likely to be recruited, people who actually know more about religion are less likely to be supporters of the extremists. And I also look at the IRA, which also battled that sectarian. They kept saying, we're not sectarian. But in the end, the violence did become sectarian because of it divided the two communities, Protestant and Catholic, and everybody forgot that Wolfe Tone had been a Protestant. And that the origins of it were in republicanism, not in defense of Catholicism. So they couldn't keep religion out, although they wanted it not to be about religion. But I agree completely that you really have to look closely at each case to see the complicated relationship between religion and the use of violence. And put everybody in the same category really means you're creating a sort of false uniformity among groups that are actually quite disparate.
Surprised by the bibliography of the paper, because putting aside all of us against the political science of government departments, I don't see any more building scholars for this thing.
I think it is cited.
The Fight of God and Blue Cold War in particular, I think very clear without sometimes this dichotomy between what the synthesis rather between politics and religion, especially Marx's discussion of disease, that well justification for war, not only against Hitler, but also against sacrifice. wanted to show the continuity of terrorism. This is one of the big mistakes I think that new scholars make, coming post 9/11. To them, the conventional wisdom is written by people who were published in 2003.
Yes, that's right.
All of us have done too much. This is why much as my students resent the weeks that we spend on the Russian revolutionaries and especially left-wing terrorists, it's enormously outdated. 20 Red Army faction terrorists terrorized Germany. Imagine the 40,000 plus insurgents, much less well-governed state in Iran. But I think your point about suicide, though, I mean, there's an important difference, is that the difference in people who, of course, sacrificed themselves in the past is that even with the Russian revolutionaries that we discussed, their act of death was not an essential ingredient of the successful attack. They went at it with a risk that I think any soldier, almost any terrorist, undertakes violence, knowing that you might die. Suicide terrorism, I think, is very different tactically. Your death is a prerequisite for its success. And I think what shows to me the new terrorism compared to the old suicide terrorism before centuries, in more modern times, it existed for the past 25 years from Hezbollah in 1982 and 1911. But then we saw, for instance, suicide terrorism was frequent, uncommon. It was perpetrated until late 2000. What we find is that it's now spread to the 30 countries, that 78% of all suicide terrorist attacks occurred since 9/11, so it's undeniably more attractive. And one reason we find suicide terrorism on average kills more than 4 times as many people as innocent others. The argument, you haven't mentioned documentary, and this is to me what separates terrorism from terrorism. Indisputably, those groups that have had the greatest consequences, no matter how half-baked, across the realm of mass destruction, have been religious groups. Sharifia is the one we know, but just think of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. They not only were pursuing development in chemical, in biological, in radiological, but in nuclear, across all 4. And in fact, in the biological realm, they were so determined to develop weapons that could harm people en masse. They had parallel programs going on for Toronto and Kandahar. And then finally, I think, finally, I know I wasn't asked. 2 things, we almost anachronistically adhere to the notion that terrorists weren't interested in killing. That was the conventional wisdom throughout the last part of the century. I wonder if we're still becoming anachronistic adhering to the notion that terrorists, that there isn't a strong degree of psychopathology and of homicidal intentions in terrorism today. The reason I say this is I lecture often now in Columbia. And a few months ago, I made that point. There was this horrific response from people who began to describe the violence. And that leads me to the last question of how we're often asking the wrong questions in this area. I don't think it's what constrains terrorists. I think, in my view, this is reality, it's what motivates these great violence. By the same token, there seems to be a fashion now with why terrorism ends. To me, that question is completely immaterial. As David Rappaport wrote years ago, 90% of all terrorist groups don't last more than 5 years. I don't care about that. They're pushed to the side. It's the 10% that last more than 5, like Al-Qaeda that's going to celebrate its 20th anniversary in 2 years, or the ELN and the FARC that have been fighting since 1963 and 1964, Hezbollah since 1982, or Hamas since 87. That's what deserves and demands our attention, and I think it's that longevity that also plays into the value.
I'd like to give you a chance to respond. Well, how about 2 minutes? I'll just respond very briefly because, of course, those are all important points. And as I said, there's a debate. You see, there is really a debate about all of this. I'll just make a couple of short points. One, the empirical point that there has been a lot of statistical work on patterns of terrorism. Bruce is quite right. But I have some problems with that, although it's not my field either, and so it's hard for me to judge the precise methodologies that are used. But I do know that the data that's most often used in these large-scale transnational statistical studies covers only international or transnational incidents of terrorism.
So anything that's domestic is not going to be in that data set that Todd Sandler and Enders and others use. It's a data set that is just international incidents. So anything that occurred within the boundaries of a country between two citizens of a country that the target was not a foreigner, didn't occur outside the boundaries, is not going to be in that database. So that always gives me a certain pause in looking at the generalizability of their results. I don't think that religion is not important, but I do think that it is, you have to weigh what the other motivations might be, and it's very difficult to tell what's really driving that motivation. And for example, I wouldn't consider Aum Shinrikyo really a conventional religious group. In fact, I think of it as an example of a group that really was sui generis and doesn't fit very well with other so-called religious groups like, say, Hezbollah. What would Hezbollah and Aum Shinrikyo, why would they pursue the same directives? And if religion is driving a search for weapons of mass destruction, do all religious groups seek this? Only some religious groups? If only some, why those? But it's important to ask. And I think actually, in my defense, I do cite Mark Juergensmeyer's book, but I disagree with him. I think it's a really very interesting book, but he has chapters that are devoted to what he sees as the differences between religious and secular terrorism. For example, he says religious terrorism is performed as theater. Well, I think terrorism by any group is performed as theater. I don't see that religion drives that. And martyrdom, I see that religion could strengthen the importance of martyrdom. Certain religions could, others might not. But that also that secular groups can have very powerful strains of martyrdom. If we looked at the hunger strikers in the IRA, it's a very complicated thing. The Catholic Church condemned the hunger strikers, but still they drew on a deep reverence for martyrdom in going about the hunger strikes. So there are a lot of paradoxes in there. But I still find it rather difficult to separate out religious as a category in and of itself that is the motivation for these groups. But I do think we certainly need more discussion of this, and we need more discussion of why some groups live for quite a long time and others don't, because I don't think we have the obvious answers for that at all. So, okay, thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Stephen Simon, who will be giving us a critique of the war on terror. Stephen is with the Council on Foreign Relations.
Hi, I'm really glad we got the debate over whether terrorism was a candy mint or a breath mint out of the way before I came up here. Those are deep waters. I dare not enter them. A critique of the war on terrorism, I take it that my assignment was to talk about the American war on terrorism, not everyone else's. You know, I'll pay homage to the point that everyone is supposed to make when addressing him or herself to this topic, namely that you can't make war on a noun, you know, it's a stupid phrase and all that. Okay, it's a stupid phrase. It happens to mesh well with American religious rhetoric. Oh, there I go. Oh, no. With Christians being soldiers for Christ and so forth, but anyway, that's for another speech. Overall, it seems to me the war on terrorism has shown some surprising tactical successes. I think at the tactical level, it's shown some interesting potential, especially if you look just at the number of al-Qaeda operators who have been killed or captured since 2001. The list is actually very impressive. There have also been, I don't know, I did a sort of an informal count, about 30 major conspiracies that have been disrupted since 2001. There probably been many more, and we just really don't know about them because reports on them don't enter the public domain. And the other important fact, of course, from an American perspective, is that there hasn't been an attack in the United States since September 11th, 2001. There have been plots, but there haven't been any attacks, and this has to be regarded as an extremely important thing, certainly at the tactical level. At the strategic level, success has been elusive for a couple of reasons, it seems to me. The U.S. intervention in Iraq is one, and the management of the aftermath of the invasion, and the second is the failure to jam al-Qaeda's basic narrative. As has been said before, but I'll say it again, the war in Iraq validated pivotal al-Qaeda tropes. And for those Muslims who were imbued with memories of colonization, and especially by a harder reading of Islamic tradition, Salafism that tends to focus on boundaries between good Muslims and bad Muslims, boundaries between Muslims and non-Muslims, and so forth. These tropes have been effective. The invasion and occupation of Iraq showed the United States against this ideational background to be predatory, lusting after Iraq's natural wealth, determined to humiliate Muslims, and in league with the Jews. Altogether a bad combination of things to be seen to be doing or being. This is reflected in global polling data, which have been widely circulated, mostly by Pew, but now Gallup is gathering this data as well. Another indicator, by the way, is the widespread approval in Iraq for violence against Americans. I find that, well, not entirely unsurprising, but it's an interesting additional set of data on how people think about Americans. The strangely comprehensive blunders, which a colleague of mine at MIT thinks should give rise to a whole new field of political science called blunderology, that characterize the occupation also reinforce perceptions of the U.S. as being cruel and weak. These are also bad things. Images stemming from Abu Ghraib alongside more prosaic images of an Iraq stripped of electricity and basic security have raised serious questions about American intentions and abilities. These questions serve jihadist interests. At the same time, perceptions that foreign jihadists connected to al-Qaeda, especially the network founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, were the ones who thwarted American designs on Iraq and have boosted al-Qaeda's reputation. Accordingly, America's defeat in Iraq is likely to be celebrated by jihadists and their recruiters as the second momentous victory in the history of the movement, following the defeat of another empire, the Soviets in Afghanistan. The demise of the USSR and its defeat in Afghanistan will fuel corresponding fantasies in the jihadist imagination and their fevered brains about the fate of the United States. Moreover, the possibility that Al-Anbar, the province in western Iraq, will be the home to a new al-Qaeda infrastructure and send fighters trained in urban combat to Europe and elsewhere is not far-fetched against this background, and certainly U.S. planners. Actually, there's something of a division of opinion on this, depending on who you talk to in the intelligence community, that is to say, the intelligence community on the military side of the house and on the non-military sort of CIA side of the house, about the likelihood of Anbar devolving to an al-Qaeda mini-state that serves as a source of terrorism. But in any case, there are many who regard this as a risk. Statements by Dame Eliza Manningham-Buller, the chief of the UK's Domestic Security Service, MI5, to the effect that there are thousands of al-Qaeda sympathizers and prospective plotters in the UK alone is sobering. The coordinated view of British foreign and domestic security services is that the war in Iraq has been the single most important motivating factor in this astonishing development. And I was just in London and met with British intelligence officials, and they underscored in a way that I think actually is, well, perhaps, I don't know, we're not going to know until the show's over, but it seems